And now it's my great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker today, Pamela Chapman. Pamela is a semi-retired registered nurse. I knew I liked her right at the beginning. A nursing career spanning more than 50 years. Her most recent nursing practice was in hospice information management. Pamela is married with 2 children. Her son Kendrick is in heaven, and her daughter Ursula lives here in town. She has 2 grandchildren and 1 great-granddaughter. Grandson Kendrick is in heaven, and granddaughter Magnolia is a first-grade student at Winchell Elementary. Her 2.5-year-old great-granddaughter is Delia Laya. Her quilting journey started many years ago with her mother. Pamela was never interested in the craft until 2015, when her daughter was pregnant with her first child. And ironically, that's how a lot of us get started with quilting. She decided to make a baby quilt and discovered she had not been a very good student all those years ago. And unfortunately, on February 24th, 2015, Ezekiel James was born prematurely and subsequently died. She finished the quilt as best she knew how. Ezekiel James became her muse. She taught herself to quilt and is still learning and exploring. Some say things happen for a reason, but Pamela says things happen for a purpose. And now Pamela.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for allowing me to come and share my story with you. I is visiting here from my church home over in Drake Road Bible Baptist Church, where Pastor Kevin Lavender is the shepherd. So I would, on their behalf, bring greetings. I'd like to start off this morning to tell you about a little more about my journey. As you know, quilts, we look around and we see quilts, and they tell a story. And when I was a little girl, I sat at my mother's knees, and she didn't quilt like this. She gathered old clothes and scraps of fabric, old sheets, and even sometimes feed bags. And I sat with her as she ripped those clothes apart, ripping the buttons off, saving those buttons for another project, tearing out zippers, saving those for another project. When she got to the point where all of her fabric, her cloth was flat, all the seams gone, she began to make blocks. Mostly we did the single patch quilt, which you just sew a series of blocks together. And I learned to chain piece. I didn't know what I was doing. She just taught me how to do that, where you run the blocks 2 by 2 together through the machine, and the thread remains between each block. And she taught me on that old treadle machine, which I still have in the attic. I haven't looked at it to see if it would still work. I'm sure it will. So as I moved on in life, I lived my life, went to nursing school, got married, did all the things that I thought I was supposed to do. So I want to fast forward my life to 1994. I was working at an insurance company, and one of my coworkers was a quilter, and she did beautiful quilts. So one day she came to me with a quilt pattern that came out of Good Housekeeping or something to that effect, and said, "Oh, I think even you can do this." And so I'm like, okay, I'll try it. So I went over to the fabric store and bought all the fabric. And basically it was, you cut the strips and sew them back together, and then you make blocks. And so I'm cutting these strips, and I'm sewing it together. And I'm thinking, you know what? I am not sure this is for me. So I packed it away and kind of forgot about it. In 1999, my father entered into hospice, and so I was the primary caregiver, so I spent a lot of time with him, and he spent a lot of time sleeping, and sometimes he spent a lot of time being somewhat annoying. So one day he gets up, the aide brings him into the living room, and I'm sitting there with my sewing machine that I had set up on a TV tray. And I don't know if anybody, if you like trying that, but I needed something to do while I was hanging out with him. So one morning he comes out and he says, "What are you doing, sister?" And I said, "Daddy, I'm making a quilt." He says, "Well, that's not how your mama did it." And I said, "I know, Daddy, but this is how I'm doing it." So that was day one. Day two, same conversation. So we get about to day four, and I'm getting kind of annoyed, but I'm thinking, my poor daddy, he's won't have long to stay here. So I'm like, okay, I can't do this every day. So I said, one day he came out about day four. He says, "What you doing, sister?" And I explained to him. He explained to me that's not how Mama did it. So I finally said, "Look, Daddy, you about working my last nerve. Now, I'm going to tell you, I'm going to say it once, I'm not going to say it again. Now, it looks like from where I sit, you're going to see Mama before I do. So how about you take one of these blocks with you and you show it to her and let her decide if this is how we quilt or not?" Well, he loved that idea. And he said, "Now, don't you forget, you make sure Conley," he was our funeral director there in Cassopolis, "puts that in my casket, because I'm going to show that to Goldie, because I don't think this is how you do it." I said, "Okay, Daddy." I said, "But we're not going to talk about it anymore, right?" "Right. I'm good." So we didn't talk about it again. Well, in 1999, and he died in September of that year. So at my last time with my daddy at the funeral home, I asked for some private time. So at our last daddy-daughter conversation, I tucked that quilt block away and reminded him to give that to Mama so she could let us know. So I put it away, forgot all about it. I went back to his home where I packed that box away again. So I left it there. Well, in 2014, our daughter, Ursula, is in the back with her daughter and her husband, became pregnant. And I went with her to the ultrasound. And we could see the baby and the little heartbeat flashing in there. And we were so excited. So when we came back to the car, I had left my Bible in the car from church the day before. And she picked the Bible up and she said, I'm going to name my baby the first name I see in this Bible. So she closed her eyes and she allowed the pages to fall open, and lo and behold, it fell open to Ezekiel. And I'm like, wow, Ezekiel. What a magical biblical character I thought he was, and I still think that. So we went ahead, and she went ahead and named the baby. So all through the pregnancy, we called the baby Ezekiel James. That was his daddy's middle name, Ezekiel James. And I thought, how beautiful is this? Well, in 2015, in February 24th in 2015, God in his infinite wisdom, with his sovereign plan, called baby Ezekiel back to himself. He called him home early. But what that little tiny workman of the Lord left was tremendous inspiration and incredible hope. So I had started making that quilt, and I finished it. Now remember, I wasn't a very good student. I did bring the quilt along today to show you. I did finish it. My neighbor had given me a box of fabric that belonged to his wife, and I thought, oh, this is perfect because Joanne, that was my neighbor, and Ursula, they kind of had a little bit of a bond. So I started cutting and sewing, and suddenly I realized that, you know what, there has to be a better method than this. So I figured out, I did the best I could, and I finished it for his memorial service. And you'll see, you can see it, that it's not, it was made with a great deal of love. But at the memorial service, we hung it up on a board for friends and family to write a message about baby Ezekiel and to give them their support. So that was my first independent quilt. So I continued on my quilting journey, and I made all kinds of quilts. And then in 2016, the following year after Ezekiel went to be with the Lord, I had an urge. It was more than an urge. It was an obsession to finish that 1994 and 1999 quilt. Had to finish it. So once again, I haul the box out, take it all out, finish sewing everything together, cutting all of the blocks. Then I got to the point where the most exciting time is when you lay the blocks together and you get to see your wonderful, wonderful work and your craftsmanship. I laid it all out, and I was missing a block. And I went crazy. I tore my house apart. I climbed up in the attic. I looked through boxes. Where is that block? Well, Daddy got the last laugh. And we theorized that even though he had died 5 years ago at that time, he probably had just now gotten around to giving that block to my mama. So that's how my journey started. And I like to say, for every quilt, there's a story, and sometimes maybe two stories, and that's how I started. So I wanted to go ahead and talk a little bit about the Underground Railroad quilt. Now, slavery, as we all know, was just a horrendous situation for the enslaved people. And it's very complex. The escape routes were very, very complex, and they were multiple. They were multiple escape routes. So we wonder, how did they know it was time to go? And we theorize, and it's probably true if you listen to the Gospels, especially Steal Away and Follow the Drinking Gourd. If you listen to those or you read those words, he calls me through the thunder, and then there's the lightning, and in the drinking gourd. So when did they know to leave? And mostly in the spring and summer, because that's when in the Follow the Drinking Gourd, that's where they talk about the greenness that's coming back. So it was in the springtime. So that's when most of the journeys would start. Now there were people who just cut and ran. They just said, I'm not going to do this anymore, and they ran. But we want to talk a little bit about the Underground Railroad. And the most famous, most recognizable conductor of the Underground Railroad was Harriet Tubman. She certainly wasn't the only one. But Harriet had a very interesting story. She was not a very big woman. And when she was a young child, she was hit in the head. And after that, they called her crazy. And so she had seizures, so she had some sort of epilepsy, which, that was crazy back then. So what she would do is she would appear at the Sunday night church, or that church outdoors, like a church meeting, that the plantation overseers would put on. Now, their intent was to keep the people enslaved, because that was their livelihood. I mean, that's what the South was made of. I mean, that's who built the South. And so they had these meetings, and they were late. They were late because, remember, they worked in the fields, what they used to say, from can to can't, which meant from sun up to sundown. I'll work when I can until as late as I can. And so when they would go to these church meetings, a conductor, most likely Harriet Tubman, would show up, and she would be in disguise, and she would dance around and sing and make a lot of noise. And the overseers thought, wow, we have truly met our goal. We have Christianized these people, so they are always under our control. But what they didn't understand, that the same God was looking out for the enslaved, that the overseers were so-called worshiping. So what came to mind when I was reading this and putting it together is, when we look in Psalms, and it's 24:1, that says, the earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof, and everything is the Lord's. So nothing really belonged to these people, and that was their first mistake. So when they would sing the song, Steal Away was probably the most important song. Is if you read all of the lyrics, it tells a whole story. So when we get to the Underground Railroad quilts, or the blocks, and we have made ours as a sampler, which means there's only one block of each quilt. But in the days of the time that they would be escaping, the whole quilt. Now the first quilt, I don't know if I have the first quilt, I'm gonna step back and then here we go. Am I supposed to do something? Okay, I'm good. Okay, the first quilt that would be hung out would be the, what we call the Jacob's Ladder. It's now been renamed the Underground Railroad quilt block. And if you want to look over it's the first block in that quilt as well. And what that conveyed is that we're planning an escape, but you have to know that this is going to be a rough journey. So that's the story that quilt, the message that quilt would convey. Also, if you notice on Pastor Paralee's quilt over there, her ladder is going to the left. And notice on mine, it is going to the right. That was also used for direction. Now we know that we were always traveling north, and they would say west, northwest. And that sometimes doesn't make sense to people because we're traveling northwest. We are the Midwest. Why are we the Midwest? Because when we look at where the East Coast, we were west. And so then as it progressed. So and if you're coming from South Carolina, you're going northwest. So this block was the first one displayed. And it was displayed on a fence post, clothesline, porch, wherever it could be displayed. Now, back to the plantation overseers, and this is the carpenter's star or carpenter's wheel. And this just truly represents Jesus Christ. This represents the faith that the freedom seekers would have to have. It's Jesus Christ. So this is where this block comes in. Now we look at some of the blocks, they're secondary blocks. There were 10 original blocks. Now, and also you might see this as the carpenter's wheel in the quilt. So I looked at this and I thought, okay, this is all biblically based. I mean, you can go through the whole Bible and figure out that this was a complex situation. When they made a commitment to escape, it was a life or death commitment, especially if you were riding along with Harriet, because she said, I will shoot you. You can't turn back. Once you get on this railroad with me, you can't turn back. So it was a life and death commitment. So when we go back to, I think Pat read that, the monkey wrench turns the wheel. Now, who is the monkey wrench? The monkey wrench is the blacksmith. And the reason it was important to go to the blacksmith is because he knew the lay of the land. Because sometimes the blacksmith would be farmed out to other plantations, and so he knew where things were. He was a smart man. And this one is near and dear to my heart. My son was a blacksmith. And so I love that block. I make them all the time, just for fun. So when we go to the blacksmith, the blacksmith, that was the next quilt that would be hung out. Planning an escape, and there it is, the second block over there, and gather your tools. You're going to need things to survive. And some literature says that they had knives, to protect themselves, hatchets, because they would need to, construct some kind of shelter along the way. They would maybe need to clear paths. So they had to gather their tools and implements. And not only were they gathering physical tools, they had to learn how to be mentally alert, know their surroundings. So it entailed, doing a lot more, a lot of prep. We have to get ready for this journey. So as the monkey wrench turns the wagon wheel, and that's the third one, and what that represents is pack. You need to pack, you need to be efficient when you're packing. And, when you go on a trip, you don't want to check your bag. This is what I thought of years later, hundreds of years later. It's like when you pack a bag, you don't want to do a check, so you strategically pack your carry-on, you're right? So pack what you need, but pack very smartly. And also, the wagons. They were often constructed and made by the enslaved people, so there were hidden compartments, false bottoms. Some of the wagons is said to be able to hold comfortably. I don't know how you'd be comfortable laying, over in the bed of a wagon, but it could comfortably accommodate 4 adults, 2 adults, and several children. So the wagon wheel said to pack your bags and get ready to go. And this is where baby Ezekiel kind of came back to me. Remember in Ezekiel, at the wheel, in the middle of the wheel. So when I reflect back, there's a lot of faith that went into this journey. So once they got, then they were to turn the wheel toward Canada on the Bear Paws Trail. And that's another reason that we know that these escapes happened in the spring, because the bears would be waking up and they would be leaving their caves looking for food. So you follow the Bear's Paw Trail, you could find water and food along the way. So that's why they were instructed to go on the Bear's Paw Trail. Now, there's a secondary block. I didn't put it in my quilt, but it would be the second from the bottom next to the bear's paw. And that's the baskets. And it makes sense that you're following the bear to find food, so pack your baskets. Make yourself a nice little picnic lunch. So that's a secondary block. That is not one of the originals. I didn't put it in mine, but that's okay. But I think there were a total of 20 in Eleanor Burns' book when she wrote the book, the pattern book. So now once they got to the crossroads, the first crossroads they came to would be Cleveland, Ohio. The second crossroads was Detroit. Cleveland, Ohio is called the City of Hope for the freedom seekers. So once they got over the Appalachian Mountains, they were looked for the crossroads. At that time, they were to seek some kind of shelter in the log cabin. Now that became a kind of a confusing, and everyone that I listened to and everyone that I read about, it had multiple meanings. Now it could be that they were to build a log cabin because a log cabin has dirt floors. It could be that they're looking for a log cabin, a safe house to be safe. Now, when we think about the log cabin, we got to the crossroads of Cleveland. Now we're looking for the log cabin. I don't want to lose myself here. Traditionally, on a log cabin block had a red center. That was a traditional log cabin quilt. Red center indicate the hearth or the heart of the home. In this case, the center block was either black, which indicated that this is a safe house, or yellow, which indicated that you should look for the lantern. And oftentimes there was someone in the woods or far off that had a lantern. And so that's what was the difference there with that log cabin block. Now in my log cabin block, where is she? I did a yellow kenta cloth, just because I like African fabrics. And the quilt also just conveyed to seek safety. It could be an alert, an alarm that, hey, there's something happening here, you need to find safety. Shoe fly, the next block, was an original block, was an actual person. I was very intrigued and my imagination went crazy with this because I'm a magically thinking person. This had to be a shrewd person. It had to be someone with that took their responsibility seriously, and this person was responsible for making sure that once the slaves got off the freedom seekers got off the trail, they looked like slaves because they were probably dirty and tattered and torn. And so shoe fly, and that's when you look at over here, it says he told us to dress up in satin, cotton, and bows. And to expand on that, and also disguise. Disguise yourself. Get out there, look like you belong here. So that was that person's responsibility. So, and he was also responsible for finding the safe houses. They often hid in cemeteries and graveyards. So the freedom seekers would hide in graveyards until their next stop was plotted. Okay, so we changed into satin and satin bows. Now we're following the flying geese. And that was north, because we know they were migrating north because it was summer. And the birds of the air. So it wasn't just the flying geese. And like if you couldn't see the geese, you hear them flying over your house now. They're heading toward Canada. Why? Because they're Canadian geese. No. They're going home. No. I just see if you were alert out there. So once we're following the flying geese, we're going to follow the geese on a drunkard's path, which meant and it was easy. It was easy for these freedom seekers to do that because they believed that that's how you should always travel, because evil travels in a straight line. So, and this told them to go on the drunkard's path. So you're going to weave back and forth and, double back on your tracks. This confused the slave hunters and the dogs, because now what do I do? So that was something that they were told to do. Now, the sailboat is also a secondary block, and that block became very important in 1850 when the fugitive slave law was passed and enacted, which said the law was always there, but it was never really enforced. It didn't have any power to it. So it wasn't enough for the freedom seekers to get to the freed states, because of this new law said that any slave in a free state had to be returned to its owner. So it was very important for them to get to Canada. The only way they were getting to Canada was on a boat. And this became important too. The safe houses were important because they were held up there and they were not returned, often were not returned. So the sailboat became very, very important. Always the North Star. They were always going to the North Star. And when we think about the North Star, the Bethlehem Star, sometimes you will find the Bethlehem Star in the quilts, because it was always seeking the freedom of Jesus Christ. So, the history is very, very complex, and there is controversy, there's discussion whether or not this is true, but when you think about it, there had to be something. There had to be something, because there was a lot of thought put into this escape. We have to think about it, a lot of strategy. So it had to be something, I choose to believe that it's true. And when I listen to documentaries and reading articles, is that one of the reasons that there's controversy, and maybe it's not true, is because the plantation overseers didn't think that this group of people that was under their thumbs had that much intellect and that much forethought to be able to do that. So it was kind of like, we were outwitted, and we don't like that. So I don't profess to be an expert in this area. I'm intrigued by it. I love quilting. I just love learning new things. So I hope that gives you some insight into how the quilts were used in a secret code to free hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, thousands of slaves, led them to freedom, all based on their faith in Christ. Again, I thank you for allowing me to come before you and share what I have. And I appreciate this so much. Thank you.